Welcome back to Chapter 9. In this video, we're talking about adding a form to your web pages. The first thing you want to keep in mind is the actual structure of a form. The very basis of it is this right here, your starting form tag and your ending form tag. Form tags must have specific items, specifically the method and the action. We'll get to those in just a minute. But when you're creating a form, regardless of whatever's inside of it, you should have a starting and an ending form tag and an action and a method. Let's discuss these in a little more detail. First thing about the method tells the form how to send the data. You have two possible methods. That is the get, which is sending the form data using the URL. And you have the post. This is sending the form data behind the scenes. In the Code With Me videos, I'll show you a good example of these in use so you have a better idea about how the form data is passed. Next is the action. This tells the form where to send the data. From the previous lecture, if you talked about the form handlers, this is basically the external page, in this case .php, .asp, .py, or etc. But basically where the form data will be processed. For example, update a database record, create a new record, process information in a file, store information in a file, or etc. As long as you have these two items or attributes in the form tag, it will give you a better idea about how the form will be structured. But if you do have passwords in your form, never send your passwords via a get method. I'll show you a good example of that in the Code With Me videos so you can see the security vulnerability when you're passing passwords via a get method. For form fields, the most basic part of it is the input tag. The input tag allows you to create a form field and has different attributes that we'll get to in just a minute. The most important one that you should know of is the type attribute, because that tells the browser what kind of form field this input tag is going to create. The rest are optional for now. We'll get to those in just a minute. The first one is a text field. Basically, this field allows for the input of just about any text, numbers, letters, special characters, symbols, etc. This is also the default fallback for unknown field types. We'll get to those in just a minute. A few attributes of the input tag for the text type are size, which sets the width of the text box, max length, giving you a maximum length or characters that can be put inside of this text box. Value pre-fills the text box with something. Read only means that it's not editable, and disabled means that you can view it, but the text box is unable to be used. There's a reason for this. We'll get to that in a minute. On top of the text type, you also have labels, which for some odd reason in this 21st century year, labels are not used in about 75% of websites. Labels make things a lot easier when you're navigating websites and forms, specifically the tiny checkboxes and radio buttons. We'll get to those in just a minute. What labels are identifiers for form input fields. They are easy for sighted users who can read and for screen readers to read aloud. They are clickable to provide focus for inputs as long as you have the for and the ID matching. They are useful for small fields like I mentioned for checkboxes and radios, and the only attribute is the for attribute, which should match the ID of an input field. Otherwise, well, it's kind of hard to have something in a label that doesn't exactly identify with an input type. If you have a label that has a for attribute but no ID for an input, then your validator is going to say, hey, this label doesn't have anything to associate itself with. So you need to make sure that the for attribute matches an ID in some kind of input. Next is submitting a form. When you're submitting a form, you want to make sure your input fields have IDs and names. Basically, when you're submitting a form, you must make sure that it has a submit button. The submit button allows the form to be submitted so that the information can be sent to the form handler. On top of that, you should have IDs and names. it is recommended that the ID and the name match. This isn't the case in all situations, but it is a good practice to have. Once we get to radio buttons, you'll see a good example of IDs and names that don't match, but there's a reason for that. The ID provides a unique identifier for the field. We just talked about labels in the previous slide. In this one, it gives a unique identifier for the actual input field. The name allows the field to store a value in a variable. So for example, if you were to have a field that has name, for example first name, and just say John, that allows the form itself to pass the information with the name of first name to the form handler and store John in the variable first name. So that way, once the form handler knows how to process the information, you're giving it a variable to process instead of just the word John. This way it knows what to do with the information present. When you're coding your form, you want to make sure the readability of your form works just as well as you're reading it as you are the coding it. So when you're working with forms like this is a very simple form. In this case, it has the form action process form. This is where the form's going to go. Method is get, which means it's going to process in the URL. You have two labels and two input types. Don't forget that the for should match the ID, and the ID and the name should match. Then you have a submit button, so that way it can actually be submitted to a form processor. When you have form fields for emails, this is actually an HTML5 technique. This allows for the input of an email address. If the @ sign is not present, then it presents an error to the users for modern browsers only. So to give you a good example, this name@email.com, name@email.org, name@email.net, name@email.cat, name@email.xyz, and name@email are all valid email addresses. Basically, as long as it has the @ sign, then it's going to say, hey, this is a valid email address, even though it may not exist. It is valid, and therefore the form can proceed. So all of these addresses are valid when it comes to HTML5 email input types. Next, you have password fields. This allows for the input and the obfuscation of a password. So no matter what is put in, a letter, number, space, special character, etc., it will be obfuscated by a dot. Most modern browsers allow for dots. Some older browsers may just have asterisks, but in most cases, whatever it is, a password field will obfuscate it. However, when it is sent to the form handler, it will be decoded to plain text. So keep that in mind when you're sending passwords. Next is phone or tel fields. This is a tel type. What it does on mobile browsers, it changes the keyboard to a number pad for easier typing of numbers. Otherwise, you have to change the keyboard on a mobile device to numbers itself, or go into a way that you can type numbers, and it's a little harder to type. So in this case, it allows for the creation of a number-based keyboard, make it easier to type numbers. On regular browsers like desktops and laptops, it basically does nothing special. It just falls back to the type of text and allows you to put in pretty much anything that you could type. If you have this on a mobile browser, it does allow for the introduction of alphanumeric characters, but it makes it easier once you create a number-based pad for them to work on. There is no client-side validation for this, and again on desktop browsers it falls back to text. So keep that in mind when you're actually working with validation, and we'll get to that in a few videos. Next is URL fields. This is a special text field for inputting web addresses or URLs. It does require some kind of protocol such as HTTP, HTTPS, etc. Otherwise produces a client-side error. Next are file fields. This provides a browse button to pick a file to be uploaded up to the server. This does have a little different specification when it comes to the form handlers, but again, that's not for this class. Keep in mind that when you're actually working with file inputs, this may provide a false local address. For example, // just say you're on Windows, fakepath/file.txt. This is actually a security issue that was corrected a few years ago so that when web developers would upload files, it seemed almost like a security issue when the full file path was uploaded or sent. Based on this, the server will not see the user's upload path, so the fake local address may be created. The file will still be uploaded, but in this case, the server will not see where the file is coming from. Next are date fields. This allows for the picking of a date using an easy-to-use date picker. This will provide the date in a 4-number year, 2-number month, 2-number date format, regardless of region or location. There are a few attributes for this, min and max, to allow you to set the minimum and maximum date. Now keep in mind this does not work on all browsers and may provide a warning once you send it through the validator, basically saying that, hey, this isn't supported by all browsers, please find an alternative. It is just a warning, it is okay. But before we get into that, let's do a little quiz. Hopefully this seems kind of familiar from the time tag, but if you take a look at this date right here, 06/07/08, what could this be? June 7th, 2008, July 6th, 2008, August 6th, 2007, August 7th, 2006, or June 7th, 3008. Technically, you have no way to know, so the date field allows you to say, hey, you can pick a date no matter what it is, and the server will still receive a standardized date format. So that way you know if they mean July 6, 2008, that is what they mean, versus June 7th, 2008, or vice versa. Next are number fields, and this is date fields. Number fields allow you to provide a scale or a spinner for the selection of a number. This usually provides an up and down arrow for the ease of selection and can be navigated using the up and down keyboard arrows. A few attributes are min and max, so you can set the minimum and maximum numbers, and step, basically how much to skip. For example, if you say step equals 5, then once you go up or down, it'll say 0, 5, 10, 15, etc. That's it for this section. In the next section, we'll talk about more uncommon form field types. If you have any questions regarding Chapter 9, please send me an email or hit me up on Twitter, and I'll get back to you with the best possible answer.